In 5, 6, 7, 8. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Smart and Public podcast. This is a podcast where we talk about life, careers, business through the eyes of PR and comms and marketing people and your mom and everyone. Everyone's invited. This is an all-inclusive podcast to talk about comms and marketing and public relations. I'm Katie Boyson.
And I'm Katie Duffy.
And we've got a sweet guest today. We're so excited. We've got Abenaa Hayes. Anybody that is a part of the mixing board group knows Abenaa. She is not only like a power connector, but she also just reaches out, helps people in her network. She does some really, really great work that we'll talk about with her clients as well and throughout her career. But Abenaa, just we're so happy to have you on the pod. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let me introduce you and then you can introduce yourself. How does that sound? Is that redundant or are you down with that?
Totally down with that. Totally down with that.
Perfect. Perfect. So Abenaa is the founder and CEO of Elysee Consulting. She's a communications and brand executive who's worked with companies from startups to growth to established US and global firms in healthcare and social impact and more. Abenaa's professional mission is to guide leaders in brands who want to meet 21st century societal mandates head on. I love that. And I want to talk to you about that later. And to accomplish that, she focuses on driving engagement and transformation through inclusive communications. Love it.
Thank you.
Before we dive into your journey, can I ask you about the societal mandates head on? What does that mean to you? Tell the people what that means.
I mean, it's so many things. And I think we literally are seeing it live and in action if you're not only here living in the US, but observing it outside of the US. Like I literally am in a WhatsApp group with friends of mine in the UK who are asking 20 questions about what's happening here. And then I have friends who live in Canada who are like feeling a lot of the impacts as well. So, I mean, I think, and it's not just unique to today. I mean, for the last decade plus, I think a lot of companies, communities, and brands have been dealing with a range of issues, be it things related to inclusion, be it things related to sustainability and climate, be it how people actually show up in real and authentic ways as brands, knowing that when you look at the world that we're in and what people expect, I always invoke my former agency, Enablement, and the Trust Barometer, right? Companies and business writ large are still seen as leading the way when it comes to societal change. I mean, there's some shifts in the data, but people really truly look to business in terms of setting the tone. Yeah. And I mean, we've seen so many pendulum swings in terms of where people have shown up in different ways. But at the end of the day, if we're living in a world where people have expectations to be seen and heard by the companies they work for, the brands they support, I mean, people really need to determine how they actually are going to operate and live in the moment that we're in.
Walk us through your kind of career journey and how you got into this position where this is how you're working with brands.
So I originally actually wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to be like Christiane Amanpour. I somehow saw myself reporting live from different war zones. And I
wanted to be Kathy Lee.
Nothing wrong with Kathy Lee. And let me tell you, when I went to journalism school at USC Annenberg, we had to learn how to like pivot between all those different types of reporting. So there is a tape hanging out somewhere with me at an anchor desk doing something totally fluffy and throwing it to somebody in a live shot. I swear to you.
We want the tape. We want it. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. So, I mean, and the reason I really wanted to do that is I love storytelling because I do believe that storytelling and communications has such a meaningful impact. And I pivoted really early on because I entered the job market during a recession. And then I was like, what's the like next kind of adjacent industry I could jump into? And it was PR and comms. And I started out in healthcare because I wanted to work in a sector where I could do work that was that was impactful. And I focused on disease states like HIV and cancer. So I worked on like the approvals of some of the first HIV medicines after AZT was approved eons ago. But also did a lot of work in genetic medicine in the cancer space. And I realized that I loved taking really complex information and simplifying it into ways that like made sense to people. But I also did a lot of work with patient advocacy groups as well. So to me, it was like the marriage of doing work that was like impactful, but also doing something that I loved with comms and storytelling.
Yep.
I love that. Wow. And so from healthcare PR and comms, where did you go to from there? Where did that kind of lead you?
So as I kind of came up in the agency world, and I've like worked at pretty much all of them. People tease me, it's like the tours of duty. I've done like the Edelman, Weber, and the Ogilvies. When I was coming up, I realized like I very often in certain rooms was like the only person who looked like me. For as female dominated as I think comms and PR is now, there were very few people of color.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that I brought other people along with me because I firmly believe in mentorship and like putting down that ladder so other people can lead. So I first volunteered to work with the HR team at one of my agencies on a lot of coaching and development programs.
Oh, cool.
So that's how I kind of started doing internal work related to inclusion and staffing. And then when I was at Edelman, I founded their employee resource group for Black employees and did a lot of internal thought leadership. And then in my last role, it evolved from being both internal work to external work because in the year that was 2020, and everyone not only dealing with COVID and the impacts of COVID, but then that coupled with George Floyd then meant we needed to meet the moment. And I had that moment where I was literally reviewing, I think, 15 company statements over the course of 2 hours. You'd like look at the top 20 pharma companies in the US. I was reviewing them. And that's when I was like, there's something here that we need to actually focus on. So I pivoted from client service into creating actually a practice at that agency that focused truly on like engagement through the lens of inclusion and through the lens of corporate reputation.
What was your initial impression when you were looking at those like 20 statements or something? Like, how did the companies do before you went and worked your magic on it?
Well, I think in some instances, and this was a good thing, there were a lot of companies that were actually doing a lot of what was needed, and they'd never actually publicly spoken about it.
Talked about that.
So, like I like to say, like with Whitney Houston, you have to show the receipts. Like a lot of people had the receipts.
Yeah.
There were some instances in which people didn't have the receipts. So we then had to give them guidance in terms of whether or not they even needed to say anything.
Yeah.
Because then, I mean, a lot of people actually experienced the backlash for like pretty soon after that. I think NFL was a great example when they put out a statement and I think 2 employees were like, this isn't real. And then their CEO had to come out and issue like an amended statement.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's really interesting because we touched on this a little bit in another episode around, it felt like there was, and that was, you know, one issue where I feel like you could really see it playing out sort of in real time. But in general, I feel like there was a wave where companies felt they had to be, you know, doing inclusion and diversity. And then to your point, didn't necessarily have the internal receipts, the internal kind of wood behind the arrow, as we were saying in the other episode. But we're trying to kind of play that game as well. And so I'm really interested in your perspective on like, do you have to have the programs come first and then you can start talking about it? Do you start talking about it and then that kind of builds momentum to build the programs? Like, how do you advise businesses on like, you know, how to genuinely be in this space of inclusion and diversity?
I mean, I really think it's all about, well, one is your values. You have to be values led. And if it doesn't sync up with that, then you shouldn't try to boil the ocean, because one of the interesting things, if you think of the moment that the US is in right now, and I had a conversation with Eleanor Hawkins about this, and it was in her recent newsletter. When you look at some of the companies, for example, who have pulled back, there are some whose reputation scores have actually improved a smidge because they were the companies that were never really about it in the first place, right? So if it's true to who you are, and most importantly, true to your business, then you could take, well, not even take a stand, but you could talk about how it applies to the work that you do and ultimately like the money that companies are making. Because, you know, when you look at like just demographics across the world, we're in a majority minority world, and the true will be same here in the US. And at the end of the day, a lot of these people are customers. right?
Yeah.
So you have to actually do what's right and supportive of your customers.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't make sense, then you shouldn't be putting yourself out there because it's going to look inauthentic.
Yeah.
Is that the biggest spot of kind of where you see businesses fall down when you're working with them on corporate reputation and, those types of messages?
100%. I call it the say do gap. Like they say one thing, but then they do something totally different. And there's like this ad for this like learning service here in New York where their tagline is saying it and doing it are two different things. And I love to use that framing because like y'all have both said, like if you're not actually taking the action and you don't have the proof for it, like you shouldn't really be saying.
Yeah.
And, if you haven't done anything, you could say that at most, that you need to do something and it will come. But then I would say now I wouldn't even go there.
Yeah.
Because without like substance, it's just going to be hollow. And then in this environment, you open yourself up for scrutiny.
Yeah. At what stage are companies kind of bringing you in to help with corporate reputation? Like, and are they all different types of companies, sizes, or what does that look like? Like who's giving a shit right now, Abenaa?
It's a range of people because I think, ultimately corporate reputation, as we know, is connected to how people view and perceive you and how you need to cultivate trust with the people that matter to you. And comms is at the heart of it. So I have like clients who are literally at different points of their journey. I have one that we just brought out of stealth, for example. And that work was really truly about like establishing their brand identity and how they talk about themselves and who they want to be in the world. I have another that's a high growth startup that is really truly looking at how they continue to double down on the commitment that they've made to the company that they want to build and how they want to engage with their stakeholders. I have another that's just gone through a major evolution, rebranding themselves entirely. And then the other instance in which people call me is when they're in a crisis. So I literally turn into the Olivia Pope from that US TV series, having to handle everything.
Come in and fix it. You talked
I'm
about.
sure you do it just as stylishly as Olivia Pope does.
I try. I don't have the white hat though, and I'm going to have to get a white hat too.
Yeah, you have to.
I'm also going to the Beyonce concert, so the white hat will be coming.
But perfect.
Yeah, cost per wear. You can use it for your Olivia Pope moments and the Beyonce concert.
Exactly. You can spend that extra $1. You get 2 wears out of it. When you work with brands coming out of stealth, or you just mentioned that kind of like narrative building and that messaging development, how do you get execs across the line or like having that aha moment when you're kind of building those frameworks and creating that messaging, not only from like, yes, this is the messaging that we need, but also, yes, I know how to use this day to day.
Well, it's 2 things for me. The first is, even though they usually have like a big, hairy vision, I think being able to see it in simple terms that anyone can understand usually kind of turns on a light bulb. Like I like to say, if we were in a bar, like in Brooklyn where I live, like, and you were just randomly talking to someone, how would you describe it?
Yeah.
And that's usually like one thing that starts to get people to be like, okay, fine, this thing actually works. The other piece is really truly being able to show how the message connects to both their audiences and the impact that they're looking to make. Like that same client that I talked about had said that one of the things that he valued with the engagement was the fact that I literally was able to connect the dots between the message, the audience, and the impact in a really clear and succinct way.
Yeah. When you're working with clients across healthcare and stuff, do you find that to be a completely different avenue, or is it kind of a formula that you can set up for everybody? Like, how do you manage those different industries and company sizes and regulations too?
And innovations, right. I mean, there's like a baseline for the process, but then you've got to evolve it and make it more bespoke for them. I mean, one of the things, if you think of, I'm thinking of a narrative exercise I did with a pretty large established pharma company. The thing that we had to do was to factor in a range of like perspectives from US and global stakeholders across totally different functional areas.
Hmm.
And getting them all to align on like three pillars was like the Herculean effort, right? Because, there was someone who was sitting in Switzerland who was like, well, this piece is really critical to me, right? Whereas you have somebody who's in regulatory, because in pharma, you have to deal with not only like people involved in the business or the brand or the product, you also have to deal with legal and regulatory because it's a regulated environment. So then you had to have that perspective as well and kind of carve out what like the state territories were from like a language perspective.
Yeah.
So it's like just figuring out like what those nuances are going to be. And in the case of like healthcare, when it comes to like pharma, it's also like figuring out where the guardrails are or not, and where you can actually make some like adjustments.
What does employee enablement look like on that message once it gets tiered down? Like, that just sounds really hard.
It can be hard. It's heavily matrixed, but like it's amazing how once you get like key stakeholders aligned, how they can cascade it throughout an organization. And I find more often than not, some of the larger companies have a pretty established process for that. So it's very easy to start to actually socialize things by level, by group, and then across the company. There's some who are better than others, but usually if they've got like the process, you can figure out a way to push it out in a way that's like efficient, but then also ensures everyone understands it.
I'm interested to go back. I mean, especially, you mentioned kind of sitting outside the US and observing what's going on. And to some extent, we have a part of that sort of happening here in Australia as well. We're about to go into an election on Saturday. We sort of have that more conservative movement coming in, and some of the companies here are also looking at, inclusion and diversity. Do you think this is a moment in time and we're going to go back and see another wave where it becomes kind of, a thing that everybody wants to do again? Do you think this is a symptom of like the kind of broader economic challenges that we're facing in a couple of markets, and, businesses are kind of having to really focus on the bottom line, and therefore some of these things are kind of falling away when it comes down to like where the rubber meets the road? Or do you think it'll swing back around? I'm just really interested in your perspective on kind of the time we're in right now for diversity and inclusion.
That's a really interesting question because there's so many different kind of connecting, kind of influencing factors, if you will. I think there are always pendulum swings when you look at movements and things related to just like change writ large, regardless of if it's climate or what have you. So it may be a situation where things start to evolve. I think the one thing that if you look at what's happened here in the US in terms of how this has changed, there's definitely been a recalibration and a reframing. But there are experts who will tell you that the time was right for that. There's a really great piece, Forbes piece, that was published by Doug Melville. It's on LinkedIn, and he talks about the fact that, maybe this was time for like a recalibration.
Yeah.
Because, there's so many reasons for why we are where we are, but at the end of the day, like I said, if we know that our audiences, our customers come from a range of different identities, like inclusive of everybody, you still got to figure out a way to make sure that you engage them.
Yeah.
Right. And to your point about like business and the bottom line, you could separate those two, but they're interconnected.
Yep.
Right. Because if you look at just a US example again, what's happened with Target? Target has lost an insane amount of foot traffic since they rolled all of their stuff back. So there is a financial implication.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So, if companies are looking to make money and they know who their customers are, it's in their best interest to figure out how they serve those customers, regardless of whether or not they are from a different generation, or they have a different like gender identity, or they're from a different cultural group.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's sorry, Boyson. I think that's a really good point, because I think too much of it maybe is focused on and not to say this is a bad thing, but a lot of it is around the employee base and what the employee base wants, and kind of how the company wants to be. But you're right. It's like, if we fundamentally break it back down to, you have a customer base that you're serving, how best to serve those customers come from a diverse set of backgrounds and identities. And so thinking about that, keeping that front of mind means you probably still need to do some element of this. Maybe the language is changing. Maybe the activities are changing. I thought the the Marriott example was a really good one where, you know, the CEO kind of said, we've always had these values. The words might be different,
Right.
but the values remain the same, and we're not going to change our core values as a business. And then their employee base really reacted to that. And I mean, these are the people that are at the front line with customers.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was a really good example of like riding the wave of like this kind of, you know, maybe the words, we don't want to use them anymore, but the values are always going to be the same and we're not straying from those values. So yeah, I just thought that was a really good example in the US.
Yeah. And Elf Beauty is also another really great example because, I mean, they're a pretty inclusive beauty brand, right? They've also taken stances. There was that whole campaign they did last year on So Many Dicks about the man named Dick.
Oh, I didn't see that.
It's brilliant. And they were referencing the lack of gender diversity on boards.
Yeah.
But their CEO basically came out and said, this is the way we operate, because he said, I have had 20 quarters of strong business growth. Why am I going to?
Why would I pivot? Yeah. Huh. Oh, I love that one. Yeah.
I also just wonder where the opportunity is to be using employees as a sounding board for a lot of that stuff as well. Like use them as a part of your community and as a part of your audience, and help create programs or messaging, or at least just get feedback on what you want to do.
I mean, a lot of companies actually do that. They probably don't say it as publicly as they probably should, but there's one that comes to mind because I actually saw a post from them on LinkedIn about this today, and that's Pfizer, right? Pfizer has had a community council for well over a decade, and that they have helped inform brand campaigns, be it related to like a product launch or an awareness an initiative that they're involved in. And they kind of serve almost as additional kind of like sounding boards and focus groups for a lot of what they do internally. There's huge value in it when it's done in the right way.
Yeah. I think that the danger for companies is engaging the employees and then not listening and acting on the feedback you get, because then you kind of get this loop of like, well, we told you we cared about this and then you didn't, you know. So I think it's just like, if you genuinely want the voice of your employees, especially I think if your employees are frontline to customers, you know, coming back to that point about customers, like if they are day to day, you know, interacting with your customers, then, you know, making sure that they feel engaged in who you are as a brand and the values is really important.
100%. And if it is that you have to change whatever approach it is you're taking, that means you just have to be transparent. Because it's very often people, when changes are made or advice is not taken on board, people don't communicate that.
Yeah.
And that also causes challenges too.
Thinking about that kind of level of engagement too, like from your perspective, how are communicators and kind of others that you're seeing navigating the DEI kind of pushback that's happening in the US at the moment? Like, what's the vibe that you're seeing?
It's been interesting. And like, I kind of feel like in a lot of ways, a lot of people are not only partnering with lawyers, but having to like look at things through the lens of the law. And broadly, there have been like three kind of responses, if you will, to what's happened. And there are two legal scholars from NYU who are like the leading experts in this, and they've got a brilliant framework, but they basically are like, you're seeing three responses. The companies that are just deciding when in Rome, we're going to do what they tell us to do. So that's what you've seen from Meta.
Yeah.
You have the companies that are taking the embassy approach, which is, all right, we will figure out how to navigate in this world while still trying to do what we're going to do. Most companies are in that bucket. And then there's the other bucket of the companies that are like, nothing's going to change. We're standing firm, which are the ones they refer to as the activists or the advocates. And that's where you're seeing like the Costco's of the world, the Marriott's of the world. And then when you think of the communications piece of it, right, you're seeing a lot of language evolution because of a lot of legal developments, right?
Yes.
So there's a heavier focus now on inclusion and belonging. And I think that a lot of that actually makes sense, because when you look at what people want from like a company perspective, people just want to thrive and they want to feel like they belong where they are, right? So you're seeing a focus on that. But what's interesting is you're like the way people are articulating it, sometimes it's really clear and sometimes it's a mishmash of information. And I think the clearer a company is and the easier they are, the easier they can connect it to their values, that's the win, right? Like
Yeah.
McDonald's is a really good example of a company that not only said what they believed, but explained it. And the immediate like hot takes were like, oh my God, look at what they did. And they actually went into the comments on LinkedIn and explained themselves and then put out another statement to reiterate it.
Yeah.
And the sentiment changed.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the companies that, and it's like that framework you just described, I think would be super helpful if a company is like, if I'm a comms person sitting in the room with the C-suite of, you know, and they're saying, what should we do? You know, we're sort of like saying to them, well, where are we on this spectrum? Like, where do we think we want to be here? And, you know, hopefully they're not at the other end if they were already doing stuff, but, you know, having a framework and then being able to say, okay, within that, we need to be super clear about how this is still connected to who we are as a company and our brand and what we've always said. And I think, you know, the language piece as a comms person to me is really interesting because it's like the words are changing, but are the actions changing? Are the intent of the company changing? And if you can say to all of that, yeah, no, not really, then okay, explain that and be really clear about that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And there's like a USA Today piece that came out here that actually touches on that, which is words may be changing, but the work is continuing. And there's some data points to support it. Like there's this one consultancy called Paradigm that when they surveyed executives, 85% of them were still going to continue the work. Because at the end of the day, if you want to have workplaces that are fair, and they did it through the lens of the workplace, to do this in some way. So it'll be interesting what happens here in the US in the next few months, because I think there's some other things that are likely going to come through the system, but it's just interesting to see where folks are landing. And again, that's why it's like, ultimately, what are you about? Who are you about? And how are you going to articulate that?
Yeah. Wow. What a fascinating time to be doing your work. Companies need you. It's wow. It is going to be very interesting to watch. I think we've probably had a less of such a strong movement here in Australia, but it has crept in. But I think and we talked about this in another podcast, but like from a legislative environment and kind of some of our anti-discrimination laws that we have here in Australia, there are certain things that we just won't do and it won't get that far. But I do think the language changes are creeping in a little bit. And, you know, we've had a big backlash around, we do at big events and public events, an acknowledgement of country, which is basically expressing, you know, that this land was not ours and it's an acknowledgement of our First Nations people. And a football team kind of didn't do it and then had to kind of come out, and there was a big furor around why. And, you know, they claimed it was a miscommunication, but everybody kind of knows that it wasn't, and that they're sort of moving away from doing this. And it just created this big conversation here in Australia around why do we do it? You know, why is it important? But I think that conversation is a product of what we're seeing overseas, is like people are being, I think, more open that they don't want to do some of these things. Or, you know, other people feel very passionately that we should, but we wouldn't have had that conversation 12 months ago. Which is really interesting to me. From my perspective, quite disheartening. But I think it's interesting that people are feeling open enough to even talk about it, because of this move away from some of this stuff.
I find that shocking that that happened. I didn't hear about that news, but
it was I think it was the Storm, Melbourne Storm. I could have got that wrong because I'm not a massive rugby league fan, but I was mostly following it, because it just created this sort of swarm around, and you know, it's interesting in Australia. I think a lot of people kind of go, oh, we've got to do the acknowledgement of country, like, you know, and it
no
always
one is sitting in the stands being like, oh, it's time for the acknowledgement. Like, I always find, and maybe this is just my personal opinion, but I find it to be like really beautiful and I quite enjoy it. But, you know,
I think it just, again, it comes back to like, what do you stand for as a company?
Right.
And, you know, from a rugby league perspective, I think they really need to examine, and this was an individual rugby league team, not the overall rugby league organization, but, like, who are your young players? Who are your, your audience, all of that stuff. And it's just interesting to me, I think, that they went out. I mean, who knows what really happened? Like, the statement was it was a miscommunication, all that sort of stuff. But a lot of people have come out and said, no, it wasn't. They don't really want to do it.
Maybe they got a new events company and they're like, oh, we've done it. Go. Time to start the game.
Who knows? But I just think it's really interesting that I think for me, the key point was that we were having this conversation. And I think 12 months ago, that would not have been a conversation, because it's like, of course we do that. That's the right thing to do. And we should be acknowledging our First Nations people. And I think it's brought out this undercurrent of people in Australia who maybe don't agree with that, but didn't feel like they could say that. So whether that's a good thing or not, I don't necessarily think it is, but maybe it is that people feel like they can speak freely. I just think it's a really interesting time for this stuff. And I'm a bit nervous to watch it all play out, but yeah, it's definitely interesting from a comms perspective.
I mean, for sure. I mean, I think as I was hearing you talk about that, I'm thinking of, I don't know, blowback's not the right word. There was some criticism, for example, earlier this year with the Super Bowl here in the US, because before this year, they had like Black Lives Matter on the yard line at all of these major games, and they didn't with the final. I think they had something along the lines is all you need is love. And I think
something like that.
We're like, how did that happen? And it was interesting hearing their head of comms talk about it, because she was like, the decision to make that change happened well before a change in administration. But like, people very quickly jumped to an assumption, and then they had to explain why they did what they did. So, I mean, it's like that clarity of message and reinforcing like the rationale for things, I think helps people understand why you do what you do. And then in that moment, they also reiterated what their commitment to inclusion and the principles of belonging were, not only as a company, but as a league. Because when you look at just how they've expanded viewership and engagement from women, and then also now how they're expanding into other countries, like I always find it fascinating that they now can fill up stadiums in the UK, which is a country that does football, which is football I grew up watching. It's like fascinating to me.
I think that the reiteration of the message, like a lot of executives, they feel opposed or like, oh, I've already said that, I don't need to say that again. And I think just having that top of mind of like, the more you say it and reiterate your position or reiterate your message, like someone might have missed that interview or missed that article. Like, I think that repetition is so important. And it feels really laborious for a lot of execs, but just keeping that top of mind for them and how important it actually is, particularly in those scenarios.
I mean, 100%. I mean, with all of the attention span of every people now is like, what, 8 seconds, literally, as long as it takes to watch a TikTok video. So you have to really, truly like pulse out that message consistently, because people will forget. But then conversely, it will then resonate and people will remember it.
Yeah, the way that the media is going too, like if it's not in the headline, people might not even read it at all.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
No, I'm like, wait. I have a question.
I tell you.
I have a question that wasn't necessarily in our prep, but you mentioned it when you were talking about kind of coming up in comms and, being one of the only people of color in the room and at the table. Do you think comms has got better? Do we have work to do? And obviously every country is going to be different in every market, but I'm interested in your perspective on like, has it got better? What else can we be doing as a community to make sure that we're kind of bringing different people up through the comms profession?
Oh, it still needs to get better. The numbers aren't great. I think I'd seen a recent report here, just like stateside, where I think the industry is still, 75 to 80% white, with all the other groups making up the remainder.
Rest,
and I think a lot of it just has to do with just where you look for talent, and then also how you view talent. Because I think this probably still holds true here in the US. There are very specific schools that a lot of people who, for example, work agency side come from.
Okay.
Interesting.
And there's so much talent that comes everywhere. Like I remember the day I realized this here. I was at a meeting and all the people on my team, half of the people on the client's team, and then someone who was one of the vendors in the room had all gone to Syracuse University.
Wow. Yeah.
And that clearly spoke to the power of their program, right?
Yeah.
Because
Sure,
they lived
yeah.
in a food school, right? But I was like, there's other places that we can get talent that does this work.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really just opening the aperture, because when you think of how comms is practiced today compared to when I first was coming up, it is so multifaceted.
Yeah.
And you need people with such a broad range of skills that I think there's like so much opportunity.
When you're in comms as well, I just feel like it needs to be a mixing pot of ideas and perspectives in order to do it well. Like it's got to be.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Because I mean, there's so many different ways to solve a problem, right? And so many different ways to like engage an audience or whomever. Like you need that diversity of thought, literally.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because when I started out, I'm going to tell a story now about myself.
Take us back to when you started.
I just remember that I didn't go to a fancy college. I went to Sac State. So like, you know, it's not anything special. And I just remember everyone being like, oh, I went to Duke, or I went to University of Oregon, and all these fancy schools. And I almost felt like, I don't know, like you feel instantly inferior, especially coming out of college, where you're going up to all these people that obviously tested better than you, like got it, or had influential families that got them into a school, things like that, where you instantly have that. So being a woman of color, I cannot even imagine like how that distances you in that room further, and what that must have felt like.
And I mean, I think one of the things that helped me was I went to graduate school in the US, but I did not go to undergrad here. I went to school in Canada. So people would look at my resume and be like, oh.
Like, is your degree good here, ma'am?
And then of course I didn't grow up here, right? Because I've now lived in the US for 30 years, but I grew up in the Caribbean. So they were like, I was not what the usual candidate was.
Yeah.
But like one of my very first employers quickly realized that when I was working on global business, I did a brilliant job because of the headset that I brought to the work.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm really glad for the people who saw past just the usual kind of, we need this person to plug and play. And actually were like, maybe we need to bring her in because there's like not only potential, but value that she could bring.
Yeah.
We love a global mindset.
It's interesting. We don't have the same kind of college culture here. So there's not necessarily that same, coming out of one school, although there are sort of slightly more prestigious universities for sure. I think for me, it's like thinking about the talent and where it's sort of what degrees talent are doing. And I think there's a bit of work for comms, like comms degrees at university to sell the comms profession to a range of different people, because it does feel like we're creating a little bit of a homogenous group of people. I think it's getting better here. And then obviously there's the diversity from a gender perspective as well. Like, as you said, it's still very female dominated. And I think, again, coming back to like your executive set, your customer set, you ultimately just hopefully want to have a team that represents, the executive set you're working with and the customers that you're working with from a business perspective. One of the things that and Boyson knows this, I've been really passionate about, is like in the markets where you're operating, hiring someone from that market. And as much as expats can be great, it's like, I think there's nothing like having someone who grew up in that market who kind of understands that world. But I see that sort of not happening as much as well. I think often, an example might be, you're hiring someone to run ASEAN and they're in Singapore, but they're an expat who's from Australia or the UK. And that's not to say they can't do it, but I think it's a shame that we're not looking for talent that has been born in that market and kind of lives and breathes that market.
I mean, that's so true, because like makes me think back to a whole range of like initiatives that I've worked on with clients who were like based in Europe or others who were based in Asia. And it was just interesting to see what like leadership teams look like, because at the end of the day, very often if you may have a global strategy, but you had to have local in-country execution.
Yeah.
And more often than not, I would actually take whatever the plan was and vet it by either a country manager client side or like a mid-level person within the office who was from the country and community who could help guide me.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think AI is going to have on like it as an impact on inclusion and kind of what all of this looks like?
I mean, I think people have already started to see and both send the warning signs and the flares about the dangers of it, because it's like garbage in, garbage out. So the models are trained on data that very often is quite biased, not only because of the people who are actually creating it, because we're all humans and we all have bias, but also just the data that they're using to inform it. So I really believe that that's where you not only need people to use human judgment, but that's where partnering with those experts from different communities whose data you need to inform your models are critical. Like they need to have seats at the table, because you're going to have all kinds of negative effects happen if it is that they continue to build the way that they build. There was an example that I gave. It was at the Mixing Board conference that some of us were at in Austin, where and it was from a BuzzFeed article when the Barbie movie was launched. And they used AI to generate images of different Barbies around the world. And the types of Barbies that were generated were so controversial that they actually have taken the piece down. So you had a Barbie from Sudan who was holding a machine gun. You had a Barbie from a Middle Eastern country that also was not painted in a positive light. And Joy Bulamini, who's from the Algorithmic Justice League, actually wrote a piece on it, because she was like, this is why we actually need to unmask all the bias in the technology.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did the article actually go up and then get taken down?
Yeah.
Like, whose oversight was that? Like,
that question I cannot answer. And the only reason I was even able to find a screenshot of it was I think there was someone reported on it on a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
You could see it on YouTube, but I don't think you can see it on BuzzFeed anymore.
Oh, that's bad decision
This
making.
comes back to like, to your point, Boyson, about oversight, like, you know, the importance of some level of like, and whether it's a comms person or not, but I do think like sometimes comms people tend to have that sort of external lens and a little bit more of that sort of ability to be like, hey, I don't know if this is going to play right. But it just reminded me of, I don't know if you saw this week, the billboard that Nike did in London for the marathon.
Nike is Nike for all the Americans out there.
I did not see that yet.
Yeah, so they did a billboard that said never again, full stop. And then basically said until next year, which, alluding to the fact that runners and marathon runners often say, like, I'm never going to do this again. And then, and then they go and do it again. But obviously in the context of Europe and the history, never again is a very sacred, you know, piece of language. And so there's been a lot of backlash to Nike. But what was interesting is like there's been a lot of discussion around, well, like, who did that go through and who was in the room? Back to our point about who was in the room. And it's like, if there's everyone in that room doesn't have any of that history or that, you know, then no one's going to necessarily pick up on it. They should have. But if you have someone in the room who has that background, who really those words mean something very different, they're probably going to say, guys, I don't think this, or girls, this is not a good idea. This doesn't, you know, and so it's just created, you know, a bit of controversy around Nike, but more importantly, this conversation around how did that get through? Like, how did that get to the point where that was a billboard? And I mean, the colors around it, like it's red in black writing, like it's just really interesting, I think. But it comes back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes
Yeah.
me think of like in those scenarios too, it always makes me think of like the emperor has no clothes. Like who is the executive in there that people are having a hard time speaking truth to?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
is it just a room full of people that isn't front of mind for them?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And like a few runners have come out and said, like, runners say this all the time. Like, it is a phrase that people say, but
But
it's
context
like
is king.
That's,
Like,
yes.
context is everything, right? And it's like,
Mhm.
okay, great. But there's also this broader historical context. And in the current climate,
Yeah.
right? Where, neo-Nazis are on the rise and like all of this other stuff that's happening,
Yeah.
you kind of got to have a sense of the world.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it's just really interesting to me. But yeah, it's worth going and kind of having a look at the articles online, but it's,
Oh, not great.
not great.
I mean, yeah, that point is so important because there have been so many like brand campaigns across like industries where you're like, who was in the room
Yeah.
and why did this ever see the light of day? I mean, there's stuff at like Balenciaga, for example.
Yes.
There was stuff here in the States with Walmart at one point, with a Juneteenth branded ice cream.
Yeah.
God.
I mean, we know what happened with Bud Light.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, that's what, that's also why, and you hear this a lot. I mean, it matters to us in comms, but you hear it a lot in the brand world too. Like you need to have multiple voices around the table because so many things see the light of day through the lens of creative. I mean, Heinz had a campaign recently as well in the UK and in the US that had backlash in both markets. Because I think in the UK imagery, it inferred a certain kind of family dynamic in Black families that was stereotypical, and similarly so in the US with the imagery that they used.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do wonder, it's like, and I mean, this comes back to like, if you could give advice, it would be like, who's in the room and do we have the right people? But then I think to your point, Boyce, and I think there's a lot of rooms where people are afraid to speak truth to power.
Mm-hmm.
And speak up and say, this doesn't feel right to me. This doesn't, I think in a lot of rooms that's a hard thing to say. And maybe in this climate as well, being seen as the person in the room who's quote unquote, not my word, but woke, that I think there's a bit of fear around that at the moment.
It's very interesting times in which we live. And I think there's an author who's British and she teaches at NYU, has a brilliant book called Higher Ground. Her name is Alison Taylor.
Okay.
And she talks about the approaches companies and brands need to take while navigating all of this. And these are trends that have been happening for years, but it's now hit a certain kind of inflection point, if you will.
If someone wanted to learn more about, best practices for, inclusion, comms, DEI, kind of what you're focusing on, like, where do you go to look and learn? Like, what can you point people to maybe learn more about best practices and how to bring that to their business?
There's like an inclusion product development guide that was from Google. That was really great because even though they looked at it through the lens of product, they talked about how you build for everyone, and there's some kind of universal principles in that. That book's it's a really, really good book and resource. I look at a lot of, again, Alison Taylor's like commentary, and I use her book a lot because she has a lot of frameworks in it. Sally Sussman, also, the woman who's the chief comms officer at Pfizer, has one as well. She has a really simple 5-step framework in terms of the questions that you ask, in terms of dealing with an issue, but then also like asking, who do you actually need to have around the table?
Yeah. Those are great. I'm going to go look up both of those.
Yeah. Frameworks. Give me all the frameworks forever and ever.
I know. Those are the things that literally serve as like the North Stars as you're trying to navigate everything.
Yeah.
Well, Abenaa, I feel like this conversation has been actually like pretty amazing, really. I feel like I've learned a lot. We're so grateful to have you on, and you make us sound smart in public by joining us and sharing your wisdom, but humble us and share. Do you have a dumb in private that you want to share with everybody?
Dumb in private. We were chatting about this when we were doing the pre-show. So I feel like my dumb in private is truly related to me being a Gen Xer, like a real Gen Xer. So it is amazing how I operate in very analog ways, even though we have access to all of this technology. So you can't see this, but I'm Post-it Note Central right now,
Yeah.
all around me. And I still write notes in a notebook, and I very often will be on calls and be like, I could very easily use my fireflies for this. So why am I here being the old school person, like writing?
Yeah.
I love taking notes though. I'm the same. I still have a notebook. I love it. It's like, it's how it gets into my brain, I feel like.
Right,
I know.
right.
Well, I asked Abenaa in the pre-show, I was like, were you a journalism major? And she was like, absolutely. And I was like, so was I. Duffy, were you journalism as well, or
No,
public relations?
I was a mixed advertising and comms degree, but I feel like I wanted to be a journalist. I just didn't do it at university.
I just feel like the habit gets in. Like you've got to write
It's a
it
miracle
down.
I went to university and made it through that degree. I feel like I mostly was at the pub, but sure.
I also, my 15-year-old niece also teases me relentlessly because while I'm a heavy Instagram user, she thinks that I'm so basic. Because she's like, I don't understand why you don't use this filter or why you don't use this font. Like, she's like, it's not just about posting the photo.
That age group scares the shit out of me. Like they know too much and they're better at us than many things already in the technology world. Like,
Oh, yeah.
Listen, I watched a show last night about the election, and they were showing all these TikTok videos that the political parties had made. And I looked at my husband, I was like, I've not seen any of these videos. Like, I've not because you don't have TikTok. And I was like, oh yeah, that's why. That's why. Yeah, they're not targeting me. I'm not that. Like, I'm on the and
I
it was
thought
just
you were gonna say,
you haven't seen it.
I thought you were gonna say like, oh, I haven't seen any of these, and he was gonna say the algorithm because you're an old lady.
No, I'm not even on there. And yet I felt somehow I should have seen them. He was like, no, you're not there. So there you go. I relate hard, definitely, to the analog life.
But I mean, I think that actually is like its own superpower in its own way. Because we can operate in both ways and we know how to like use the technology, but also use other skills that help us be more resilient. That's my thing. That's
I
how
love that. Yeah, let's just say that. We transverse both. We're like,
We're leaning into it. We're leaning into it.
I love it. Oh, Abenaa, you've been so amazing. I've really enjoyed this chat. I'm super passionate about this area, and I think, I just could talk about it all day. And yeah, we're really grateful that you gave us the time.
Yay, I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that this is the way that we're showing everybody how to be smart in public. I love the name.
Love it. And if anybody has a topic or an idea or a guest that they want to put forward, please email us at hello@smartinpublic.com. We're also on Instagram and TikTok, and like kind of YouTube, but not really, at Smart in Public Pod. But you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, anywhere you get your podcast. Please listen, like, rate, do the things.
All the things.
It helps us out a lot. So thank you guys. We'll chat to you next week. And Abenaa, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
All right.